Good evening, everyone. We're skipping the podium, and I know people are still sitting down, but just so we can get started, my experience in the few years we've been doing this is we get to the witching hour, and there's giant swaths of Asia and big important things we haven't covered, so I thought we should get going in a timely fashion. Thank you all for being here. This is a fun and interesting event usually on our calendar, and I'm sure it will be tonight, the Asia Experts Forecast. Formula is pretty simple. We take the opportunity of mid-December, the end of the year, to look at the year ahead in Asia, and we invite some great guests and willing prognosticators to our stage. We get interesting predictions, we get bold predictions, and they can be on serious matters, by the way, and they can also be on matters that are less so, and we involve the audience, both in this room and beyond. So we encourage you when the time comes for Q&A. It's great if you have questions. It's also great if you want to share some of your own interesting and perhaps bold predictions. Speaking of the audience, just some words of welcome to our front row guests, Hal and Ruth Newman from our family of Asia Society trustees. Great to have you here. And sitting with them, Ambassador Nick Platt, our President Emeritus, former president of the Asia Society, and actually a good moment to mention that this program and many others that we put on this stage here at Asia Society New York through the year are generously supported by the endowment that bears the name Nicholas and Sheila Platt. So Nick, thank you to you for all that you do and have done for this institution. So let's get right to it with introductions. First of all, you have, probably have seen in the flyers before the event the bios of our three guinea pigs tonight. To the far left, from the Harvard Kennedy School, is John Park, a great and gifted scholar, teacher, and author, a leading expert on the affairs of Northeast Asia and in particular the Korean Peninsula, but not exclusively. He's also, we're proud to say, an alumnus of the Asia Society's Asia 21 Young Leaders Network, one of the early classes. John, it's great to have you here. To my left is Wendy Cutler, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, longtime trade negotiator before that. She was a lead figure with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and a lead negotiator with both the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the U.S.-Korea trade deal, and many more. Wendy, great to have you. Up from Washington, as is the man in the middle here. Last but certainly not least, great to have back at the Asia Society. Vali Nasr was here during the UN General Assembly sessions with us, and many times before. He is Dean of SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, a great scholar, author of many books. I'm not going to list them all here. And as I say, a frequent guest at the Asia Society. One thing, actually, Vali, I didn't mention before, I'm not in the habit usually of looking at Wikipedia pages, but in an idle moment today I looked at yours, and I don't know if you even know that this line is on your Wikipedia page, but it's very relevant for tonight. Quote, "Due to the accuracy of his predictions, Nasr has been hailed as a shrewd forecaster."
He's setting me up.
Are you aware that that's on your Wikipedia page? I assume you didn't put it there, right? Anyway, welcome to you all. A personal promise I didn't make in the room, but we at the Asia Society will, a year from now, publicize all your brilliant forecasts and forget all the other ones, not that there will be other ones. And in that spirit, one of the things we do here just in preparation is look back at the year before. And without going on too much about that, it was interesting to watch. Rana Farahar from the Financial Times was here and made some pretty stellar forecasts just on GDP numbers and that sort of thing on the global economy, which is her area of expertise. Evan Medeiros from the Eurasia Group laid out pretty well what he thought might happen on the U.S.-North Korea front, not all the detail. Kevin Rudd, our Policy Institute president, predicted, this is a quote, "a rapid erosion in U.S.-China relations driven by trade tensions," so that was pretty good. And then there was Hassan Abbas from the National Defense Institute, who said that Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia would take, quote, "provocative actions to appease the conservative clerics in his country. Anyway, we live stream and record these events, so we're on the record. And if you have a prediction and you're watching from beyond the room, please email it to us at moderator@asiasociety.org, or you can tweet it using the hashtag AsiaSocietyLive. So let me start, if I may, the same way actually that we started last year, which was I've asked all the three panelists, nothing else is scripted, but this part is a little bit. I asked them to come with one area vis-a-vis Asia in 2019 that gave them particular reason for anxiety, and you could take that in many directions, but also one that brought reason for hope. John, we're going to put you on the spot first. What are you most anxious about when you look at the landscape in Asia in 2019?
Sure. First off, thank you, Tom, and thank you to the Asia Society. It's really been an honor to be Asia 21 Fellow, and I was just looking at the bios of the current class. I joined about 10 years ago, and I realized if I applied now, I wouldn't be able to get in. And so it's incredible the talent and the network that you're creating here, so kudos on that. As I look at the region, my area of concern is the spillover effects with this growing U.S.-China trade war. There is something of a 90-day truce right now, but in terms of how it's affecting the collateral damage, if you will, of all the countries there, that's the part you're very concerned about if you're looking at international order, international system. And the part that I'm looking at closely is South Korea. And if you look at a country like South Korea, it trades semi-manufactured goods to both China and the United States. It is a 90-day truce. We hope that it leads to something more substantial, but already the ripple effects of that, I think, are being felt. The part that connects to what I'm most closely looking at is the ongoing nuclear talks. President Moon, like all democratically elected leaders, was largely elected on a democratic mandate to create jobs and improve the economy. The South Korean economy had already been pretty sluggish, youth unemployment very high, and so something like a U.S. trade war is having a type of effect that could potentially sap the political capital and the support domestically for some of the diplomacy that President Moon is engaged in from the South Korean vantage point. The other thing related to this is the connection to how the leadership that traditionally have been there, the partnership between the United States and China on a number of issues. Colleagues who focus on climate change are also very concerned that this type of distraction is taking vital time away from that kind of coordination that ripples into other areas as well. So from that perspective, that is a very, very deep source of concern as we see some signs of this truce, but again, something that I think many people are assuming to be much worse before it gets better.
You got something on the hopeful side, or it's okay if you don't? I mean,
the hopeful side, this again relates to the Korean Peninsula. This isn't something to be too happy about, but compared to where we were last year, it is a much improved situation. Last year, the military professionals would say that there was a timetable and it was a political decision, and we were very, very close to that type of escalation of tensions potentially leading to conflict. What's happening now is a lowering of the threshold. It is not a function of is denuclearization going on, but rather a much lower bar of no testing of intercontinental ballistic missiles or nuclear devices, and that is creating a type of space that even stalled talks are given room to continue. So it is a measured hope. I think that can continue for a bit longer, but again, it's not a function of exceeding expectations here, but rather the expectations getting lower and lower.
Okay. We'll probably come back to both of those, and actually one of them immediately, because Wendy, I'm reminded of something you said. You see sort of some good news and bad news on the U.S.-China front, if I have that right.
That's correct, and a lot depends on one's expectations. But I predict in the U.S.-China trade dispute that the current tariffs that are in place now are going to remain for the foreseeable future. But I predict that we're not going to see further tariff increases. And the reason I predict that is I think we're getting to the point where increasing tariffs more at this point is going to end up hurting the United States in ways that we haven't experienced to date. So the next scheduled tariff increase on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports, raising the tariff from 10 to 25%, I think would really hurt U.S. consumers, U.S. businesses, U.S. workers, and no one would be able to kind of disguise that cost anymore. Now, I'm not saying that tension between the United States and China is going to subside, but I think the U.S. will focus more on other measures with respect to getting at their concerns with China, such as stepping up investment requirements, increasing export controls, and probably going forward with other kind of law enforcement actions. So it's kind of good news, bad news.
And is that your double answer then? That's your, or do you have some other?
That's my double answer.
Else?
But I'll tell you, when I think of 2019, what really worries me in this space is that the administration is going to be faced with a foreign policy crisis, and I'm not sure that they'll know how to respond, and they'll be able to respond quickly and effectively. And I say this for a couple of reasons. Number one, the administration, members of the administration are divided on a lot of issues. They don't seem to coordinate strategy very well together. Second, a lot of positions are not filled. We still have a lot of ambassador positions vacant. A lot of people have been leaving the State Department. So if a crisis happens, those communication channels are so important, particularly in the first 24 hours or so. And I worry that we just don't have the channels like we used to. And finally, I don't know where our friends and allies are going to be. We'd like to think they're going to be with us regardless of what happens. But I think a lot of things have happened over the past year, which are going to leave some of them to question whether they need to put all their eggs in our basket, whether they should enthusiastically respond to any calls from us to support us. So for those three reasons, I do worry about that going forward.
We'll come back, I think, circle back to China, maybe in Korea. Vali, if I'm not mistaken, you want to take us a little bit to West Asia, right? Or take us anywhere you want to take us.
Well, there are plenty of things to worry about across Asia, but I think one of the issues that will come to a head perhaps this year is the longest war that the United States has been in, which is the war in Afghanistan. So the president has made the decision that he wants out of this war. He's gone back to the talking to the Taliban, which was early in the 2009-2010 period, was floated during the Obama administration. He's appointed a special envoy, Ambassador Khalilzad, and has given him a very short time to arrive at a quote-unquote peace framework, peace deal that would end the war in Afghanistan. It is not going well. The time frame is very limited. He hasn't built the sort of groundwork with Pakistan, with India, with Iran around the region to help let this happen. There are different factions within his own administration on this issue, from the Pentagon to the Vice President's office to Ambassador Khalilzad. And I think this year the U.S. will, and in the meantime, the Taliban is actually gaining ground in Afghanistan, is controlling more territory, and is becoming much more aggressive. And Afghanistan is likely to also will have to have a presidential election during this year. So the U.S. will reach a point that either it has to double down again on Afghanistan, which is go back to war and try to contain the situation, which the president does not want. But the alternative is actually to privatize the war, which is to hand it off to Blackwaters and the like. And for that, therefore, then an agreement basically with the Taliban, some kind of a high-level agreement, could provide the fig leaf for the U.S. to move. That, if we arrive at that point, that could be quite consequential for the Pentagon, for Afghanistan, and for the region. And that's a major worry.
Can I just ask you one question about that, just for my benefit and the audience's? How many times, roughly, has the United States in these 17-plus years faced this kind of moment through, I guess, 3 administrations now, right? Of, do we double down or do we get out? And I mean, I feel in a way this is Groundhog Day a bit.
Right, it is Groundhog Day, but exactly under this particular president, and there might be a completely new option on the table that the United States would have never considered, which is to privatize the war. And we heard about this early on when Steve Bannon and others were in the White House, but that option is on the table. If you want to fight a war, but you don't want to fight a war, then there's only few ways in which you could do it. On the other hand, the other major issue in the region is obviously Iran and West Asia, and the Trump administration has put a very tight cordon around Iran. Iran is resisting. But ultimately, we're at an impasse right now. So the U.S. is pressuring all kinds of allies and adversaries to cease and desist in trading with Iran. And at the same time, the Iranians can sort of tolerate this for a time period, but it will gradually get to a point that it's their interest to break the impasse. You know, in other words, either they have to face a severe political situation at home or witness a degradation of their state and economic and social institutions, like what happened in Iraq under Saddam, or they would have to actually change the dynamic with the Trump administration. And I think their decisions are closely connected to what will happen in North Korea, because they've watched that conversation very carefully. You know, the North Korean foreign minister has been in Iran. The Iranian foreign minister has met with him. So they're watching very carefully the way in which the Trump administration handles the entire Korean process and whether there's wiggle room there. And also North Korea ultimately can provide Iranian leadership with the political cover domestically to make that move. So if there's something positive the North Koreans are taking out of this without leaving anything on the table, then that encourages them. I also want to sort of just put on the table as we go forward, there's also broader trends that are evident. Because of the way the Trump administration is approaching Asia, not just China, but also Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Iran, there is sort of the groundwork for, if you would, a broader anti-American coalition emerging. And I don't mean this instead of confrontation with the US, but in the sense that there are now many countries which have a common interest to contain and back off the Trump administration. I mean, at the core of this, I think, is China, Russia, and Iran, you know, three wounded civilizations which have ambition of great power status. They want to push back against the West. They've always seen the United States as an obstacle to wielding power in their near abroad. But they all are facing different kinds of pressure coming from this administration. And there's a lot more conversation that goes between them. And this is not about whether Huawei sells them telecommunication material or not. It's really about, you know, to what extent can Iran sort of reinforce what China wants to do, and to what extent does China reinforce what Iran wants to do. And so far in the United Nations, you know, the main protector of Iran have been China and Russia against varieties of sanctions, and they're also part of the nuclear deal. If the Trump administration continues to pressure this, I mean, we're very focused obviously on the narrow angle of give and take with these individual powers, but there's gradually emerging a sort of a broader sort of contours of a, whether you call it axis of resistance or sort of a Eurasian consensus about how do you contain the new United States in the region? How do you sort of create ways in which you could protect your turf from it?
Is that your term, by the way, or is that a axis of resistance?
Well, it's an axis and it's resisting, so so I guess it's a short.
Just what we need.
Yeah.
You said a moment ago before we came out, Vali, that you know, everything is connected, and I keep that in mind as I want to come around now to Huawei, which is not something we would have been talking about 2 weeks ago, right? Or we might have been, but not in the way we do now. This is obviously the arrest of their chief financial officer in Canada, because it's related. You noted that Iran and Korea are related because they're watching the North Korea thing. Technically, right? She was arrested because of Huawei's work on getting past the Iran sanctions issue. But just a broader question on the U.S.-China front. To what extent, and maybe this is for you, Wendy, or John, any of you, to what extent do you think this crisis of the moment is a bigger problem for the two powers and for other countries potentially as well than this 90-day and you know, the trade dispute itself? I mean, you now have a lot, it seems, of ordinary Chinese who are livid, right, about what the United States and Canada have done. Either of you want to jump in on that? You wrote an editorial about it the other day, didn't you?
Yeah. So I think it's, number one, it's too early to tell. That said, you're correct. I mean, if you look at, I think the Chinese, at least my view is they've been kind of measured in their response, and actually in many ways delivered a stronger message to Canada than they did to the United States. And the fact that Secretary Mnuchin, USTR Lighthizer, and Li He spoke on the phone last night to conduct the beginning of the trade negotiation, I think shows that the Chinese are still willing to go forward with the trade negotiation. But I think, you're also seeing, and I just saw this on, before I came in here tonight, that the State Department now is contemplating whether to put restrictions or at least to warn U.S. executives going to China. And so this could spiral in that direction as well. But I think in many ways it's a law enforcement action, but it's of a Chinese company with whom the United States has had very serious concerns with for many years, both with respect to sanctions, but also with respect to the practices they're using to promote their 5G technology throughout Asia and around the world. So yeah, it's too early to tell, but you can see that really any incident now between the U.S. and China is going to be scrutinized quickly, and the markets are going to interpret it, and it can spill over to other areas of the relationship.
Can I just add, I mean, looking at it from the other side, not as, to the extent that this had to do with Iran. I mean, Iran has banked on China being a sort of a backstop to a lot of the pressure that the U.S. is putting on it. In other words, even when Total left the gas fields, the Chinese company had an option. A Chinese company had an option to buy Total's shares from the Iranian government. So first of all, it's a way in which to sort of signal also to the Iranians that China is not going to bail you out, which is actually something that psychologically the Iranians have been thinking about. But more broadly, the interpretation in many areas is that this impacts the way in which China can use its trade and its money to conduct foreign policy and influence. I mean, broadly, if the U.S. could put secondary sanctions and then force China to desist from trade in certain countries, I mean, the question, if you're sitting in Pakistan, is saying, when is the hammer going to drop there, right? If the U.S. puts sanctions on certain interests in Pakistan because of the Taliban, and then the $56 billion that the Chinese have put in Pakistan,
Belt and Road money, right?
The Belt and Road money come under. So it is a shot across the bow of generally the entire, at some level, Belt and Road idea as a way of projecting Chinese influence. I mean, if the Huawei case forces the Chinese to wash their hands off Iran, I mean, let's say they say, okay, we're not going to sell anything there because first it was ZNet, then
I'm going to say with ZTE earlier this year was also Iran sanctions.
So then and then Iran sanctions happen to be the latest sanctions on a particular country. What other countries would China not be able to do business with? So I think it can have broader ramifications in that sense.
Wendy mentioned an article or a story that was breaking this afternoon. There's another one which suggests things may get worse in the short term rather than get better, which the Times, maybe others are running, the New York Times, saying that Lighthizer is pushing, well, I'll just quote this, the Trump administration planning a series of actions this week targeting China's trade, cyber, and economic policies, bringing together the work of a handful of federal agencies as part of a long-term strategy to keep pressure on Beijing. And this is all growing. Do you want to add to this Huawei picture, John, at all? Or
I just wanted to build when Wendy was mentioning about this absence of coordination in Washington.
Yeah.
I think that is true in a number of fronts. But the sanctions piece is unique because there are elements of the private sector, law enforcement. It has its own momentum. And to try to time these things, I think increasingly we're going to see more of these cases of sanctions. From a Chinese perspective, certainly at a higher level, there might be some understanding that these are distinct pathways. But as you pointed out to the broader Chinese public, this is seen as the gloves coming off, the U.S. playing dirty. But also the other piece of this, when you look at this deep well of suspicion about containment, that the U.S. is really out there to prevent the further rise of China, these type of, I think, episodes feed into that narrative that's already very strong. So going forward, this lack of coordination and management of these issues, these are going to be substantial hurdles to overcome. But the other piece of it, to zero in on the sanctions piece, and a little bit of what Vali was mentioning about the axis of resistance, there are entities and targets in the international community now that are developing drug resistance to sanctions, and that should concern us. They're developing their own pathways of doing things that the traditional national security response and the prolific policy tool, the application of sanctions, they're creating targets that are getting better at procurement, doing illicit activities, and that's clearly an unintended consequence of sanctions. But that is another broader negative consequence in the international system that we have to monitor closely.
But just one more thing on Huawei. Do you think it's plausible, possible that Chinese leaders in tech and their counterparts in this country are going to suddenly really stop or have second thoughts about going to their respective countries? I mean, because that's a whole other consequence if it's,
It is a calculation. I mean, from the perspective of compliance in the industry itself, this is a very integrated, global type of network. And some of these decisions, even in terms of Huawei doing its business in other markets and whatnot, and continuing to do there, if there is evidence of connections to Iran types of dealings, which I'm sure once they start looking down that path, there'll be more of it, these are somewhat automatic. And the Treasury State Department type of interaction on these issues, in this case dealing with the trade, but Treasury really being the main driver and the architect of these sanctions pieces, I think it's hard to dial it back.
Well, I mean, there's also the case of the Nissan chairman in Japan.
Right.
I mean, in other words, even though that might be completely legitimate.
Want to remind people?
Well, Carlos Ghosn, the chairman of, legendary chairman of Nissan, who saved the company from bankruptcy and then merged it with Renault, was arrested. He's put in a, I don't know, 10 foot by 10 foot jail in Japan. And there's a serious case of underreporting of his compensation and misuse of funds, which all may be true, but it's sort of they've crossed the Rubicon here of public action against a CEO. And look, law in many areas of the world is completely subjective. I'm sure countries like China or Iran and the like look at the sort of cases against Huawei's vice chairman as sort of not having validity. But basically we're in an era that immunity for these sort of high-profile public figures are gone. So you didn't pay your correct taxes in China, so why wouldn't they arrest you?
Right.
And we might say that's bogus.
Yeah.
But according to their laws, and again, like for instance, the Chinese, I thought it was interesting, they made a ruling in favor of Qualcomm against Apple, right? So they're getting into these sorts of legal decisions that then could have implications for executives of these companies.
All right, speaking of crossing Rubicons, let's come back to the Korean Peninsula and the point John rightly reminded us of where we were a year ago when we were having this conversation. And even the good prognosticators last year, I don't think could have imagined those scenes in Singapore and everything else we've been through this year. And so, John, you said that they might just muddle along and denuclearization would not be the standard anymore. That said, I think the Secretary of State, right, and John Bolton and others have said we're not going to another summit without very clear, verifiable things that we didn't get in Singapore. So how do you square your prediction with that? Well, start with that.
Sure. This is a top-down phenomenon. So if the leaders want to get together and have a summit, they move very quickly to get them done. It's background noise. We've had 3 summits between President Xi and Chairman Kim. There's the 4th that's anticipated for early of the start of 2019. We've had 4 between the 2 Korean presidents.
I lose track.
We lose track, exactly.
Right?
And this has happened within a year. So it gives you a sense of how it is top-down and the concern that some of the details, important details, are lost in the shuffle there. So that's one. It's top-down, and if they want to have a summit, they can have a summit. There's an interesting linkage. Whenever the 2 Korean leaders have a summit, President Trump's interest in a summit spikes. And so right now they're preparing, anticipating a visit by Chairman Kim to South Korea.
Right.
It's
Which
delayed.
would be the first ever, right?
Exactly. It's delayed for the time being, but it seemed to be a question of when rather than if. But the other phenomenon that I think is striking, we saw last year, and I think we'll see more of it going forward, is the saying in international relations, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Friends, allies, adversaries, a lot of them that have previously felt they were constrained for a number of different types of reasons. Right now, there's a greater thought about what is our plan B and how are they going to move forward on it. Mm-hmm. And that's the piece that it's okay if you're an individual country and you're trying to maximize your interest in the neighborhood, but from a systems management perspective, that's really chaotic. And so the unintended consequences rippling from that, I think we're going to see more of that in 2019. And that is something that, for countries, the aspirational piece is that's what we saw on the Korean Peninsula in terms of countries using a crisis and not letting it go to waste. And they had these diplomatic breakthroughs. But what comes next, the bars are coming down, and that's the piece that I think we can see more monolithic.
I can just comment on the top-down thing. One thing I thought was very interesting when the White House announcement came out after the meeting with Xi Jinping, the whole announcement was maybe 1 page, 1.5 pages. And in there were 2 references, one to basically what a great guy Xi Jinping was, but also referred to what a great guy Kim Jong-un is. And so I think that those personal relationships really play a very large role in this administration. So, trying to figure out, the validity of what cabinet officers say now, I think we've confused so many countries around the world that I think they're almost discounting a lot of those statements because they know, they really need to look to President Trump to figure out, where we're going and what the decisions will be.
I mean, I guess the question is that for some world leaders, this kind of personal connection hasn't worked. I don't know if has not worked. For instance, for Abe, for instance.
Yeah.
That but it's an open question whether for Kim Jong-un it actually has worked. It hasn't worked for us. We haven't got anything, but it seems like he actually has put. If I'm wrong, at least the perception is put North Korea in a different footing.
Yeah. Well, our I shouldn't call him this, but one of our internal pessimists, Danny Russell, who is elsewhere tonight, Wendy's colleague at the Policy Institute and longtime Korea hand in the administration, he offered, as did many of our colleagues, predictions of their own, and he was a little less hopeful than you are, John. And he said a projected second summit early in the year, Trump-Kim, unlikely to bridge the wide gulf between the 2 countries on denuclearization, and the U.S.-South Korean defense exercise scheduled to take place in the spring. North Korea is threatening to resume testing, coupled with significant tensions between the U.S. and China. We should expect a spike in tensions on the Korean Peninsula. And I guess, in a way, you could see your thing running into that also, but would you care to spar a little with Danny from your seat, or no?
I think that is definitely a possibility. We could see these events unfold again. Excuse me. One thing that's different now is a South Korean government that does sense the window of opportunity closing. And then another saying, better to ask for forgiveness than permission. If push comes to shove, to protect this fragile process, they might water down military exercise, they might postpone it. There are a number of things that can be done because in South Korea as well, it is top-down. And so these are the types of decisions that concern those who are functionally there to maintain the alliance, to maintain defense readiness and all of those things. But if the political consideration is a little bit more time, this could drag out. And that's the piece that I think at least for the next 12 months as we see 2019, there would be something of this trying to drag this process along as opposed to reverting back to some of the patterns that could trigger an escalation.
Now, what happens if the North and South barrel along with another summit? They're talking about some kind of economic railway. I think and what happens if that just races off in a sort of positive direction, and on the U.S. North Korean front, not much happens? Game that out then. Is that just, what's that mean for Washington? What's it mean for Seoul?
Up till now, the South Korean administration has been very meticulous in getting sanctions exemptions, close coordination with their counterparts in the U.S. government, down the street in the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee, and so forth. These are modest movements towards doing the surveying, potential blueprint planning, site visits, and so forth. But, and this is, again, to the point about this incredible machinery that is the sanctions piece of it. There was reported warnings coming out of the U.S. Embassy to South Korean banks and South Korean companies involved with this, that if they went too far, they would be subject to these sanctions and fines. Those are automatic, and the precedents of European banks and companies that were caught up on the European violations of Iran sanctions, and then fines out of the Southern District of Manhattan for essentially financial violations. South Korean companies and banks are very sensitive to that, and so there's a natural limit to even how much the Moon administration can go. But if it were to proceed, I think it would be more on the political side, where there's no end to the number of summits they could have. They could potentially explore some of the other areas that are more symbolic value rather than things that have sanctions violation potential. But I think the two Korean leaders are committed to at least keeping the Panmunjom Declaration, the inter-Korean process going, and trying to insulate it if there is this continued deadlock on the U.S.-North Korea denuclearization piece.
Okay, I'm ready to leave, but any last words? Leave U.S., China, and Korea, these sort of big, giant issues. Anybody want to, or have we put enough of a period on those? Okay, good. Wendy, let's go to Japan. You said something interesting today, and I don't know if you want to. First of all, here's a great piece of trivia at your next, perhaps at the cocktail reception downstairs after this. What do Wendy Cutler and the soon-to-be Empress of Japan have in common?
Okay.
Well,
No, I don't want everyone like shouting out.
Yeah. No, they're not.
Yeah.
They were both trade negotiators, okay? True fact. So we're gonna, the emperor's gonna abdicate. Do you want to, this is a Japan prediction from Wendy Cutler, who has spent a ton of time in that country.
So early on in my negotiating career, I worked on a number of bilateral negotiations with Japan, including the U.S.-Japan semiconductor agreement. I'm not going to say.
You remember that?
I'm not going to say which year that was, but one of my counterparts was the now Crown Princess, soon to be the Empress. Very bright woman, educated in Harvard, I think spoke 7 languages, etc. Well, come I guess it's April 30th, or May 1, she will become the Empress, with the Emperor and the current Emperor and Empress abdicating at the end of April. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the succession process in Japan, but currently only males can become, are in the line of succession. And so the current Crown Princess and Crown Prince, they only have one daughter. And so the succession line is that the Crown Prince brother who has a son, that son would become the next emperor down the line. So my prediction is, particularly given Abe's, Prime Minister Abe's Womenomics program, and I also, trying to underscore the importance of women in the Japanese society, and coupled with, I think, the kind of embrace, the warm public embrace that people will have of the new empress, I predict that the process will start again in at least the government, if not the Diet, to change the succession line and to allow females to assume that role and be in the line of succession.
Wow.
Interesting.
Pretty bold.
Heard it here first.
Pretty bold.
And you probably haven't thought of that one, but it was on my mind, so I'm sharing it.
I suspect, Wendy, in a year's time, we'll be sitting here, whoever is on this stage, and we will be toasting your superb prediction.
Or you'll all be laughing at it.
No. There are a slew of important elections coming in Asia next year, and we don't have the time to go through all of them, but Indonesia, Thailand, after promising in that country where there's been a military regime for years, they have pledged to have an election in the early part of the year. Vali mentioned Afghanistan. Actually, do you think the election there will go forward, given everything you said before?
Well, if it doesn't go forward, then it would add, I think, to the sense of crisis in the country, and it would actually help the Taliban. If it goes forward, then it's possible that the government would change, and that would add to the complexity. It's that there's no sort of an easy. The elections can only add to problems, basically.
Right.
You're an optimist.
Yeah. Australia, Kevin Rudd is not here, but I think it's a fair bet that another year, another prime minister in Australia. But Vali, maybe we can come to you on India, if you don't mind. So just a week ago, Ruchir Sharma, who is an economist by training with Morgan Stanley, but he's written a book about the electoral process. He's, I guess, covered or watched elections for 20 years in India, and he has a book coming out. He said just last week here on this stage that no shoo-in for Narendra Modi, and for a variety of reasons, upset among farmers and not a tough enough line against Hindu nationalists and other things. And speaking of today news, there is news today from a series of state elections in India that have gone very poorly for the BJP. So I don't know if you're willing to address this in prediction terms, but is Narendra Modi in some trouble or overstated, or what do you think?
Well, I think the sense, at least from where I look at it, the sense that he was anxious about the elections came in from how aggressively he asked for exemptions for sale of Iranian oil to India.
Yeah.
Because India relies for 15% of its energy on Iran. It could not replace that immediately, and if he hadn't got the exemptions, he argued very forcefully that it would cause shortages and inflation in India, and that would affect him adversely. So, in others, is an indicator that he was nervous about the elections. I think he has two things going for him. One is that there is no real leader that opposes him. The Congress Party does not have a strong candidate. There's nobody who really could lead the charge against him. And also within BJP, he does not have somebody who's going to threaten his position. I think this is going to be a situation that's more akin to Angela Merkel in Germany. So he's going to lose certain amount of seats. He'll be forced to bring in additional parties into a coalition that would basically tarnish his sort of uber image that he has had as sort of an invincible leader. And then depending on what parties he has to make a deal with in what areas, he will have to water down some of BJP's policies, which actually may help him in terms of what he can deliver. But alternatively, I think his domestic politics is going to become messier. And we might have a break on certain things like very aggressive social policies that BJP has been following, like punishing Muslim butchers and sort of that kind of enforcement of a very hardline Hindu nationalism. That may actually slacken, and that would not be necessarily a bad thing.
They love to hate incumbents in India, don't they?
Well, incumbents also don't deliver, and expectations for Modi were quite high. And also Modi sort of is delivering much more at a national level, which is what we see from the outside. But at a local level, it's actually what party and what government in particular provinces is delivering. And people ultimately, in a lot of these elections, particularly at the state elections, which we've seen, vote for bread and butter issues. Who's going to fix their roads and who's going to give them things. So Modi has not been as strong in being able to actually deliver in a tangible way, and so he's been vulnerable.
Okay. Anybody want to weigh in either on India or any of those other places where they're going to the polls? I'll go out on a very easy limb and say that Jokowi wins in Indonesia again. And by the way, my record here is really poor, so...
But you said Tillerson would still be in, right?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Wendy. Thank you.
Oh, I wasn't supposed to remind us to say it. Whoops.
Yes, I did, and for no reason. We were sitting here and throwing that around last year, and I thought I'd go on a limb and say that Tillerson would still be... Why don't we stick with that for a second? Not Tillerson.
Okay.
But obviously, you all know, and the point has been made, that even though it's not an Asian matter, the people who run foreign policy, whether it's top-down or otherwise, in Washington, matter for, in different ways for all the things we've been talking about. So let's look at the people who are now in the apparatus of things that cross global policy in Washington. And maybe someone wants to hazard a guess and risk my fate. Pompeo, Jim Mattis, John Bolton, who am I forgetting? Steve Mnuchin, Lighthizer, Heather Nauert. Anybody want to, who in that group is not in that group anymore a year from now? I think it's a safe bet that one of them at least will not be in it.
I'm going to really go out on a limb and say Mattis. He's been there the longest. The president has started to kind of express some concerns with him, including hinting that he might be a Democrat. He just doesn't seem to be in that inner circle as much. So that group, he's top on my list, which I think is unfortunate.
I agree with Wendy. I think Mattis is most likely to move on. But I think the sort of a larger issue is that if the administration becomes much more focused on domestic issues, domestic problems of the president, the 2020, does it mean that the foreign policy sort of management sort of falls by the wayside and is not going to pay attention to it? So there is no big urge to shift people. And I think the question is whether this will actually give somebody like Bolton or Pompeo much more latitude to actually really run the policy, form and run a policy, because he's no longer focused on it. Or that, on the other hand, actually American foreign policy could lose even more focus, let's say on places like China. If he's not paying attention, you have 10 different policies. I think that's a big question this year.
Or if things are bad at home, there are presidents then who become very active on the international scene.
Although I have to say, I would then say he's unique in that he can find ample issues at home to divert attention. He really doesn't need to really look abroad.
Right. We need some more hopeful things.
Tom, if I could add one
Yes,
part
please.
of this tying into the broader management of the international system. This president doesn't like disasters or failures. So if you follow the trend lines, and for 2019, we're likely to see more crises, but we're not going to see the reaction time. Issues that could have been dealt with in a timely manner could lose control in a time that's critical. So if that is the case, and that's a broader trend line, then one could argue that all the key positions in the administration are vulnerable on trade issues, on security issues, and other things. So that's a part where you're not going to get the reverse of more capable, more experienced individuals, but individuals who I think will have a harder time piecing together what their background is and what they've done before, because these types of flare-ups could potentially grow.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. We want to come to the room because there are a lot of you, and I'm sure there's a lot of better questions than I have. But just quickly, we haven't talked much about economic growth, and I know that's not, just sort of growth forecasting. Come to you, Wendy. You had an interesting thing to say about one country in particular in Asia. It's not surprising that when you look at the forecast for the next year, and you look at upsides, whether you're looking at Bloomberg or The Economist or wherever, a lot of the countries are in the part of the world we care about. But you have one in particular you think is in for a particularly bearish year, yeah?
Well, I think
Bullish
year. I think on the economic front, I think Vietnam is really going to be very interesting to watch. And two things. They already have a high growth rate, over 6% the past few years. But two things I think really work in their favor, given what's going on, particularly in the U.S.-China world, and that is that a number of U.S. and other companies are looking to diversify outside of China, and Vietnam seems to be one of the countries where a number of companies already have investments, so they can expand those investments pretty quickly, as opposed to setting up totally new plants, leaving China and building a plant somewhere else. So I think Vietnam can really benefit from that. Also, the TPP-11 is going to come into effect at the end of this month, and Vietnam wasn't one of the initial 6 countries that completed their domestic procedures, but Vietnam will join a few weeks after. And I think that will really give a seal of approval for Vietnam in the region, that it has high intellectual property protection, it has good investment protections, good labor practices, et cetera. And so I think that's going to also play in Vietnam's favor. And I think what is interesting is that the other country that I think could really benefit from the TPP-11 coming into effect is Malaysia. But Malaysia now is, under Mahathir, is reviewing whether the TPP agreement is indeed in their interest. So Malaysia hasn't ratified, and to date, isn't going to be one of the early participants in this agreement. So I think Vietnam is going to be an interesting country to watch, and as the IMF predicts lower growth rates for a number of almost all countries in the region because of trade tensions and protectionist U.S. policies, I think that Vietnam may escape that.
So here's something that strikes me as an out there prediction. We had a great event a few months ago here on Bitcoin. I thought it was great just because I didn't understand it at all, and then an hour later I felt I did a little bit. But your fellow alum of the Asia 21 network, John Paul Rivera, in the new class just recently minted in the Philippines, he's founder of a kind of LinkedIn for Asia called Caliber. He says a central bank in Asia in 2019, my bet is China or Singapore, will publicly state that they are holding Bitcoin as a reserve currency, sending the price of Bitcoin skyrocketing and setting the stage for a massive transformation in the world economy. The dollar will no longer reign supreme as the world's only reserve currency. And like a lot of things with crypto, I don't really understand that, but anybody want to jump in, or should we just let that one?
Let's discuss that a year from now.
Yeah. Or at the reception. Okay. Open to your questions. There are mics front and back, and who wants to go first? Yes, sir. First hand I saw right here with the scarf. Can you wait for the mic? If you can give us your name and keep it kind of brief, and if there's somebody in particular you want to direct it to.
Sam Schwab, open to the panel. We talked about the United States initiating certain actions in Asia, but there are other potential instigators out there back to the United States. I was wondering if you might comment on Russia and Putin and what actions he might take that haven't been discussed tonight with respect to Asia. Obviously, he's flown a plane to Venezuela. There have been a lot of things he's done to tweak the United States.
Axis of resistance.
Well, I mean, in West Asia, the Russians have played fairly big hand, not only in Syria, but also they have this now alliance of OPEC plus, essentially controlling the oil market along with Saudi Arabia with OPEC. On the other hand, they also have a very strong economic and military and intelligence relationship with Iran. They've sort of used the vacuum of U.S. absence in the Middle East to move in very aggressively. On East Asia, obviously they have their finger in all sorts of things in Asia. They've come back into Afghanistan again in alliance with Iran. Even at the diplomatic level, there are three sort of Taliban groups that you have to think about. There is the group in Qatar, in Doha, which the U.S. is negotiating with. There's a group that perhaps Pakistan has set up in Abu Dhabi, which the vice president favors the U.S. would talk to. And then there's the Moscow group, which is the Taliban that have sort of peeled off and are closer to Iran and Russia. So the fact that even Russians are sort of coming back into Afghanistan, they would like to be a factor with North Korea, with China as well. They're playing an opportunistic game. I don't think they have the economic wherewithal, but I think the main issue for them is that a lot of Russia's interest in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, parallels interests that other countries have in Asia, Iran, China, about their areas of spheres of influence. And the Russians are, I think, very keen to find levers in Asia that they could basically bargain with the U.S. And Europe about their position in Ukraine, but also with the Baltic states going forward. And then there's also a great deal of interest in sale of weapons to Asia, to India, to Iran, even to some Arab countries, encouraging them to hedge. That the only way to sort of hedge with Russia against Iran is to put money on the table with buying Russian military hardware.
Okay, and by the way, if you just have a prediction you want to share, that's fine too. Yes, the woman right behind you, John.
Thank you, Manisha Sharma. My question is open to the panel. I was curious, going back to Huawei, what are your impressions about the motivation of Canada? Why would they get involved and actually go through the arrest and get the ear of China? Of course, the rule of law is very important and the local enforcement, but I was curious, based on your experience, why would they actually go ahead and get involved? And of course, they're getting so much pushback from the US right now, all the steel tariffs, I mean, affecting them so closely. What would be the reason for them to provide so much cooperation on such a big front? Thank you.
And what alternatively could they have done? Could they have just, that's a legal question, right?
It's like really a legal question. I don't think they probably had a lot of debate there about what to do. They, I think the word goes out to look for this woman as she's, as she was going through any airport. We have, legal arrangements with Canada, and they did what's expected of them. But I have to say, when I read this, and I was thinking of those words after, what was it, the G7 between the president and Trudeau,
yeah.
And I was thinking, of all countries, let's, I'm sure Canada's kind of has, let's just say, some reservations about the United States now.
But is there a way, and I don't know if this is a
Yeah.
legal or international relations question, where you made the point earlier, Wendy, that you're worried about our allies being willing to step up to the plate for us when it comes to, I mean, could the Canadians have just, is there a look the other way option here? Is there a under the rug option, or?
Yeah, I don't know the details here. I don't think so, and I think that they
Sounds
have
like
an
a course
interest.
at the Kennedy
Right.
School or SAIS, right? I mean,
I
what,
think they have
you
an
know.
interest in being on the same page with us on these types of matters.
Right.
We've always cooperated, but I think there are other types of matters where there's a lot more discretion, and there's no kind of legal requirements or things that are in their interest for enforcement authorities to work together across the border. I mean, that's
But you see, the
That's right,
excuse
that's right.
matters as well. I mean,
Sure.
had this been about cybersecurity issues, et cetera, the Canadians could have weighed in about the weight of American legal case. But Canada has always cooperated on sanctions on Iran, and if this is about violation of sanctions on Iran, there's no precedent for Canada to question U.S. authority on this.
Yeah.
Nick,
I just wanted to add,
if we got to get your mic just so the folks outside the room can hear.
I was in Japan at the time that Mr. Tanaka was getting into trouble with Lockheed. And we were having other issues with the Japanese. And the way that was handled was to treat them as two separate tracks, which they are, in fact. One is a law enforcement track, a judicial track, and the other is a political diplomatic track. And if you early on separate those tracks and say, Huawei thing we deal with on the judicial track, and keep the other things on the other track, that is a way of managing it.
Right.
Yeah, and in fairness, that's what Larry Kudlow said, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, that this is because people were beginning to conflate the two, because the arrest of the Huawei executive Meng happened on the same day that the president was meeting with Xi. And I think some people in China really think, they can't even believe this is a coincidence, right? It has to have been part of a greater conspiracy. But after that happened, Kudlow was out there in public, and I think it was a great statement saying that these are kind of two separate tracks, the trade talks and what happened in Huawei. He goes, again, like if they, what?
We've done it before.
Yeah, exactly.
Mr. Tanaka was a sitting prime minister. Not to
Okay.
say duck.
Yes. Sorry, I'm making it difficult here, but maybe we can, the woman there, great.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Klara Wyrzykowska, I work for the United Nations. I have a question. After the whole context you described for 2019, what will be the situation in terms of human rights? What will be the new issues? How will be the current crisis solved? How do you see the general landscape of human rights in Asia in 2019? And it's a question
Human rights
for...
question, and maybe just to, I'm sprinkling these throughout. My colleague Sanjeev Sirchan here at the Asia Society has a prediction that the Rohingya will continue to be, quote, the most persecuted minority in the world. We haven't mentioned them or Myanmar tonight. While the global community will fail to hold the government of Myanmar accountable for the atrocities, et cetera, et cetera.
On the human rights part, there were 3 North Korean officials who were sanctioned for human rights. But rather than that being a priority of this U.S. administration, those are legacy programs and pieces of legislation from prior administrations. You see the phenomenon. If the U.S. doesn't prioritize human rights, then other countries won't prioritize it as well. So I think that's one element of leading by example that we're going to, unfortunately, I think, see more backsliding on the sanctions related to human rights, but human rights as an issue altogether, unfortunately, in 2019.
Oh, boy. Daniel, and then we better have a front mic and a back mic, and then we'll go ahead.
Hi, Daniel Moss, columnist, Bloomberg Opinion. There's been a pretty powerful narrative for a while now, going back a number of years, that US influence in Asia is on the wane and China's influence economically, strategically, financially, you name it, is on the rise. Anything happened in the past 12 months that's led you to maybe question that?
For the past few weeks.
Yeah. Well, 2 things come to mind on that. First is something it hit my mind earlier. I think it was a month or 2 ago, we had Bruce Stokes, who is a poller with the Pew Research Foundation, and he was showing the latest polls about Asians' views of the United States, of the administration, but of the United States. And it was quite striking how many countries in Asia still view the United States very favorably. And particularly when I talk to my colleagues in the Asia Society who travel a lot in Asia, you continue to hear the desire for strong U.S. engagement in the region, regardless of what's going on now, and a real desire for us to kind of come back to the table. So that comes to mind. The second thing I think that comes to mind, there's no doubt that Chinese influence is increasing, but I don't know if it's kind of a zero-sum game because their influence is increasing, ours is necessarily decreasing. But I think one issue where we may next year have a very different view of a Chinese initiative is the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's fascinating to me over the past few months how we are seeing a lot of international and Asian concerns being expressed about projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. And we're even seeing some indications that maybe China's pulling back from publicizing and talking about the Belt and Road Initiative as extensively as they were a year ago.
There's 2 things, right? It's whether the influence is on the rise or on the wane, but also are the impressions favorable or negative? And those 2 things don't always run in tandem. But go ahead, Vali.
Exactly. It's how you set it up. And first of all, whether sort of as Wendy said, there's a zero-sum calculation. But I would say there is a sense that this administration is really out to cut China at the knees. China cannot resist militarily or economically to sort of completely change China's positioning, economic ability, role in the region. But that does not mean that even if they're successful, that the U.S. actually has a influence comparable to what it had. And I would say the reason is that it doesn't appear that the U.S. is deciding the fate of Asia in any way, or U.S.-led institutions are playing that role. At least in West Asia, the U.S. has not really changed the dynamic of what is happening in West Asia, which is the rise of the non-Arab powers, particularly Iran and Turkey. The alliance with, say, Saudi Arabia was ephemeral to start with, and now it's actually in trouble because of the problems Saudi Arabia has ran into. And I think that if you sort of come back without the U.S. deciding the big trade deals, without the U.S. actually laying out what the security structure in Asia is going to look like. At least the Obama administration had a vision of how that might work. If anything, you might say that after China, once you're done with trade with China, where are you going to go? You're probably going to go after Vietnam next, which has a $40 billion trade surplus with the U.S. So, as I said, the U.S. is probably I would say in the longer run, the greatest contribution U.S. is going to make is actually define a sort of a set of issues that a lot of Asian countries will find in common, and so it's sort of deciding the fate of the region against the United States. But we're not leading. You know, America first does not mean laying out a vision that the rest of Asia could rally towards. So I think that's the measure of influence. So, you know, in other words, you end up you can only have so much control in the short run in terms of how you bully people on trade and various issues.
I feel like I want to ask my colleagues with the microphone to do the choosing here. This is too hard. John, why don't you find somebody you like? And,
Go for it.
Hi, Sridhar Lele. I have one question that relates to another question. So at the beginning of the year, John Bolton was saying about the Libya model for North Korea, but it looks like in next year it will be more like the Pakistan model where they get to keep the missiles and the nukes. So then that relates to what Vali was saying. So partly I think the troops are there in Afghanistan as a fail-safe so that they can be in Pakistan on the ground in an hour in case they need to. Is that part of the reason why 3 presidents have not removed troops from Afghanistan also?
So if I can start on your analogy to the Pakistan model, I think there's some interesting parallels to that. You know, clearly here, the top priority is denuclearization. In the region, denuclearization is, in practice, number 2. Using this diplomatic opening to have more of the economic cooperation, economic integration, a different type of future for North Korea. And organically, if they feel secure to give up their nuclear weapons, then that's the desired outcome. That seems to be the momentum in the region. And if you look at that, North Korea may disassemble, dismantle some of the nuclear complex, the facilities. But retaining a minimal nuclear deterrent is something that I think is the open secret. People view that as realistic. And most importantly, when they play that simulation, if I were North Korea, what would I do? All of them come to the same conclusion. So I think the ground truth in the region is that North Korea could become more and more like a Pakistan model. And certainly a Chinese priority to see stability in North Korea, political regime, the economic stability, goes back to a Chinese view, not of a standalone North Korea policy or standalone South Korea policy, but this balanced Korean peninsular policy. So to your point about the Pakistan model, it will be Pakistan model plus alpha. The alpha component is already North Korean elites and the top state trading companies are embedded in the Chinese marketplace. Pakistan doesn't really enjoy that type of benefit. So there's a lot to be said about things that are already happening being scaled up.
Well, I mean, I think the Libya model, even for Iran, was the main worry of there's no point talking to President Trump because that's a photo opportunity. But John Bolton means by Libya model that you pack everything, you put it in a box, you send it outside, and then we decide whether we want to talk to you or not. So if actually there is a Pakistan model on the table, you're much more likely to get engagement because that's much more about realistic talks, which countries which have missiles or nuclear capability can negotiate with them rather than giving them up before you even would negotiate with them. I don't think Afghanistan has anything to do with controlling Pakistan. I mean, the force size of the United States in Afghanistan is nowhere near trying to discipline or manage a country of 180 million people. I mean, that just would be foolhardy. So, I know a lot of Pakistanis think that, but in reality, the problem of Afghanistan is that the U.S. cannot find a way to get out, right? And I think one window of opportunity, if we thought about it, the one success I would say President Trump has had is to actually exorcise, the sort of ghost of counterterrorism out of American minds. And it's not a priority, right? It's not on page 1, page 2, page 3. We were so obsessed with Russia, with cyber, with China, that in some ways there's a lot more political room to get out of Afghanistan. Because we're not preoccupied as a country. Even TV dramas are no longer about terrorism. If something is about terrorism, you say that's passé. That's such an old topic.
Thought of that. Yeah.
So in a way, so that actually literally allows Trump much more easily than Obama could to say there is an Afghanistan good enough. right? There is a scenario in which there might be a signature that I can say, you know, I did this, there's a photo op, and then we could hand off the security to somebody else. But the problem is that the U.S. has not been able to get out of Afghanistan because it hasn't won the war and it hasn't resolved the security issue. And if you cannot do those, there hasn't been an easy consensus about getting out of Afghanistan.
There's a weird through line here, right? That, I mean, these situations are obviously totally different, but good enough in Afghanistan, good enough on Korea, good enough maybe even on U.S.-China trade, right? I mean,
right.
That's all right. Let's see. Why don't you pick one now? Yeah. This abdication by the moderator.
Thank you. Hi, my name is C, and I work for the Federal Reserve. And so first, before I make a brief comment, you say that it's okay to make a prediction as well.
Yeah.
So before I make the brief comment, it's actually about Bitcoin. I need to say that my opinion does not necessarily represent my colleagues. So
okay, we got it. Go. Yeah.
Yeah. So as we know that currency issuance is actually a core strategic tool for any nation. So my thought is it will be very few nations, if any nation at all, will allow the public or private institution to issue any form of currency. So that's my prediction. Actually, I kind of make this prediction earlier this year when the price was like $17,000 per Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm stand with this one. So my question is, with what happened this year between U.S. and China, what do you think about how does this impact the relationship between China and Japan or China with Taiwan?
Oh, those are two very different questions. But
Thank you.
have at it, John.
We've actually seen some remarkable improvement, mending of fences between Japan and China. There is something to be said viewing Japan now as more of a partner. Remarkable. Remember all of the memes and things that went on before and the tension between the two Asian leaders there. But I think it's not from something that's proactive. I think it's reactive. Those two countries need some kind of stability on the international stage. So I think there is some kind of understanding that they're going to try to provide it. And just as a quick aside, through the process of elimination, Prime Minister Abe is really the last leader standing in terms of the liberal international order as we know it. Angela Merkel, brave decisions that she made, but she is winding up. We see what's happening in France with Macron. We see what's happening in the UK. So one by one, Japan has now inherited this mantle. And I think from a Chinese perspective, there is an important interlocutor there. Maybe a little more marginal opportunities to free ride off of the remnants of the international system as they try to keep certain parts of it going. The other element, though, that you pointed out of the U.S.-China trade war, my outside observation, listening very closely to colleagues who are more on the ground in China, President Xi is almost in a no-win situation. If he goes head-to-head with President Trump on the tariffs, then that's just escalation. But likewise, if he's seen to somehow being caving into President Trump or someone acquiescing, then there are political costs to that in China as well. So how he threads that, this 90-day truce, it's not a solution. It was just buying more time. And now we see the Huawei issue come up. You got to imagine that President Xi is in that kind of sweating buckets type of situation right now. And with that, this is where historical issues, other types of contemporary political considerations where Japan sees China as an existential crisis, all of these things are creating, and I think what Vali mentioned, this axis of resistance. The resist component is a coping mechanism for other countries as well. So I would summarize with that piece that understanding that we're seeing between China and Japan right now isn't the beginning of a new type of relationship strategically, but it's a coping mechanism.
I think Wendy had something.
Yeah, and I think like in a coping mechanism, I just add too, we're seeing a lot of countries kind of wanting to hedge their bets now and to diversify. I think it's fascinating that the trade minister in Canada, the title now is Minister of Trade and Diversification, and that doesn't mean gender diversity. It means finding other friends, finding other partners.
They have a ministry for that, huh?
Well,
Ministry of Finance.
I think one thing to watch in 2019, President Xi apparently is going to, I think it's planned to take a state visit to Tokyo, probably around the margins of the G20 summit in June. But I do think that China also is kind of on a charm offensive in the region, recognizing that countries want to hedge their bets. So it's kind of, they're just synergies in all these relationships right now, and it's very important for all of us just to kind of watch what's going on. But you're seeing President Xi Jinping, once he left Buenos Aires right after the G20, after the dinner with President Trump, he visited a number of countries in Latin America, then went to Portugal, and in the meantime, the president, was tweeting, well, we agreed to this, we agreed to that. Why isn't China responding? Why isn't China, saying 90 days? Why isn't China? And, some people are saying, well, give the guy, he's not even home yet. So sometimes you need to let the stuff play out. The point you made also, I really think it's spot on that, and it's not just China, but other countries too. It's much easier for them to undertake reforms or open their market if they can portray it as being kind of in their national interest versus doing this in response to pressure from the United States. So in this regard, Xi Jinping is scheduled to give a very important speech a week from now, 8 days from now, December 18th, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of their initial reform and market opening. And I think that's a speech a lot of China watchers are going to watch very closely because I suspect that he'll use that forum to explain, or hopefully, and I really hope this is the case, new reforms, new market opening. And it's fine if he portrays that he's doing this because it's in China's interest. That's not the point. The point is, is China going to move ahead in a market opening and reform direction? So I think that's going to be a very important speech to watch. And Kevin Rudd, who just gave a speech on China a week ago here, he was saying also it's going to be very important to see if President Xi Jinping goes to Davos this year, what he says on that global stage as well.
You mentioned the 40th anniversary. I commend people who are interested in, if you haven't seen it, in all this prognostication stuff. The Economist is a great year-end issue, and they have an interesting riff on not just the 40th anniversary, but the Chinese leadership hates anniversaries, according to The Economist. And 2019 will be, if I have this right, 100 years since the May 4th student movement, which of course brought us the Communist Party, so that should be a good anniversary. It is 70 years since the founding of the PRC, and 30 in June since Tiananmen. And all these things, no matter what they're actually anniversaries of, may bring people out in some way. And if you believe The Economist, the party is nervous about all of them. I think we have time for one more question, and I'll choose this one. And the gentleman right here, you've been very patient.
Hi, Matt Kliski. I have a question on the issue of succession in leading homegrown countries and what kind of impact that might have on local economies.
Succession in what?
In the leadership of homegrown countries like Alibaba or Huawei or some of the leading tech companies or conglomerates in the area. Essentially passing the leadership from the parent to the next line of potential leaders.
Who wants to take that? I don't.
Look at these eager folks here. We can also pass and go to another one if you want.
So briefly, are you talking about just Chinese technology companies? Is that your main focus?
Maybe for background, I'm a venture capitalist, so we had a lot of there's a lot of worries that Chinese and Asian companies would increasingly take over business from the West, but it seems that that's kind of been slowing, and it's kind of reversing, especially with the increasing technology aspects, more stringent regulation of investments and takeover as a ways of gaining an edge. That seems to be backing off, as well as Jack Ma retiring, but we don't really hear much about who the next leader will be, like who will be the next Tim Cook or the next leader of Microsoft, right? We don't really hear about that. So I don't know if that's an issue yet, or what kind of potential problems that might pose.
I would just briefly mention on the Chinese side of it, I was going to respond before you mentioned that. Jack Ma's announcement that he was stepping down took everyone by surprise. And then his very public statement that he had joined the Communist Party of China. So the tightening of controls in China, I think it's an ongoing thesis. And you anecdotally hear things through, in my case, I spent some time in Hong Kong in finance, so colleagues who were there. The party being very clear to remind the billionaires in China who made them billionaires. And also capital flight. The latest thing that I heard from Asian American who worked in finance there who are back in the US now, when they manage that kind of wealth, those in China who are trying to bring their money out are happy with 33%. And I was asking, what's 33%? They're okay with losing 30% of the value they're bringing out because the remainder would be in their control. That's a very odd statistic. But the part about succession, I think, is very interesting because there was hope that the entrepreneurial space, the startup scene, that would be a different type of model. But I think the message is very clear that it's not a different type of model, that it's just an extension of the party.
Vali Nasr, maybe just reaching for a hopeful note here, something just occurred to me. And no, I mean, you are dean of one of the great, really one of the great schools of diplomacy in the world in international affairs. And I wonder, your young students at Hopkins, clearly one goes into that profession to, I'm not sure they're inherently optimistic by nature, but can you say something about, I mean, if some of your great students were sitting on this stage, do you think they're more hopeful than folks like yourself who have been around for a while? Or what optimism might they find that we don't, or is that just Pollyannish of me?
I actually don't think the young generation is optimistic at all. I think they are extremely worried about the world. They're worried about climate in a way that maybe our generation isn't, because we'll be dead by. I mean, I'll be dead by then. But my son, for instance, is exactly that age. It has a very different worry about climate. They're worried about jobs. They're worried about the state of the country. They're worried about what kind of United States they're going to live in. Their memories don't go to the sort of periods of harmony and social cohesion in the U.S. So it's I think actually the level of anxiety among students is at an all-time high. And we at least in our case, I would say that many more of them don't know what they should study, whether it's worth investing 2 years to go to graduate school, whether it's worth borrowing money to do so, whether there are going to be any jobs in government. I think the level of curiosity is much more because I think the world is a much more chaotic place. So nothing is a given, and therefore they need to know a lot more, and they're curious about that. But I actually don't think that there is optimism among the young generation. I think that not until I think 2020, and if there's a pathway to some kind of a stability in the United States, I think there's a tremendous amount of worry. Okay. Sorry, I couldn't.
No, that's all right.
On a hopeful note.
It was a reach. Two final notes before we close. It's the last program in 2018 that I'll be moderating at least. And note number one is, as I think most of you know, there is a reception downstairs. A thank you from those of us at the Asia Society. It's actually staffed and run by some of our younger staffers, something new we're trying here. So you're welcome to that in the Garden Court Cafe. And we also have a favor to ask of you. We rarely do this. This is the very sort of 2-minute version of the PBS or WNYC pledge drive, much shorter than theirs. There are forms on your chairs. There are also forms with our staff on the way out. But those of you who are not members, we invite you to join the Asia Society here in New York. those of you who are, whether you are or not, and care to make a year-end contribution. You know, first-time visitors tonight or frequent visitors, whatever you are. And also, not on the forms, but the inbox is open for any ideas about, forget the predictions for a moment, but things you'd like to see more of or less of here at the Asia Society in the year to come. I am deeply grateful not only to all of you for coming, but to these terrific prognosticators for being with us and spending the time and energy to take all your questions in mind. Warm hand, please, for John Park. Thank you. That was a short pledge drive, wasn't it? Thank you, Tom. That was great. Those optimist students of yours.